Alright, let's get ready to dive deep into one of the most misunderstood chapters in the Bible, Genesis 1. We've all been told that this chapter is the ultimate account of the world's creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what if I told you that's not what it's really about? What if Genesis 1 is actually an ancient cosmological story? It's a mythological blueprint of how ancient people saw the universe. Genesis 1 is a scientific or historical account of the origin of the material world. To understand it, you need to put yourself in the shoes of the ancient Israelites. They didn't have telescopes, satellites, or access to scientific journals. Their world was very different from ours. They saw the universe as the earth was a flat plane. Above it, the heavens were a solid dome holding back chaotic waters with windows that opened to let rain through. Below it was the underworld, the great deep waters. Everything had its place in this ordered structure. Here's the kicker: Genesis 1 isn't the only ancient creation story out there. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, and the Egyptians all had their own creation myths, and guess what? They're strikingly similar to what we see in Genesis. Let's look at the Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, for example. In this story, the god Marduk battles the chaotic sea goddess Tiamat and splits her body in two, creating the sky and the earth. It's similar to Genesis 1, verses 6 to 7, where God separates the waters to create the sky and the earth. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it. Genesis 1, verses 6 to 7. The idea of separating chaotic waters to establish order isn't unique to the Bible. It's an ancient motif repeated across cultures. Genesis 1 is tapping into that same cosmological framework. This means that Genesis 1 is a highly stylized poetic narrative, not a detailed play-by-play. The Hebrew word for create, bara, isn't just about material creation. It's more about assigning function and order. In the ancient world, creation was about giving purpose to chaos and shaping the cosmos into something meaningful. So when the text says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens," it's not just about making physical stuff from nothing. It's about bringing order from chaos and separating light from darkness, water from land, and giving everything its role. This is about establishing a functioning world, not just assembling a planet piece by piece like some kind of divine Lego set. It's not about making things from scratch. It's about bringing order from chaos, separating light from darkness, water from land, and giving everything its role. It's about establishing a functioning world, not putting a planet together like some kind of divine Lego set. John H. Walton is one of the most influential scholars in this field. His book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, is a game changer. Walton argues that the ancients didn't care about material creation the way we do. They were focused on functionality. They wanted to know what purpose something served, why the sun rises and sets, and what the meaning behind the cycles was. Genesis 1 answers these questions about nature, not ours about atoms or galaxies. The Israelites were also surrounded by these massive empires, Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. Each had their own version of how the world came to be. The Israelites were heavily influenced by these surrounding cultures, and you can see traces of that in their writing. But here's the twist: is that Genesis 1 takes these common mythological ideas and gives them a radical monotheistic spin. It's not multiple gods duking it out for control of the universe. It's one God calmly speaking order into existence. There's no cosmic battle, no struggle, just a peaceful declaration of purpose. And where did this all happen? Let's rewind to the 6th century BCE during the Babylonian exile. In the 6th century BCE, during the Babylonian exile, the Israelites were living in Babylon, a city full of temples to gods like Marduk and Ishtar. Their faith was under pressure, and it's in this context that Genesis 1 begins to take shape. The Israelites were telling a story that wasn't just about how the world began, but also about how their God was supreme and unlike the other gods. The chaotic, warring gods of their Babylonian captors were a theological manifesto. God wasn't just some local deity, he was the ruler of the entire cosmos. In Genesis 1, God doesn't fight the chaos, he simply speaks, and order is established. So, what's the takeaway? Genesis 1 isn't trying to give us a modern scientific explanation for the origin of the universe. The universe is a rich, ancient text that reflects the worldview of the Israelites and their surrounding cultures. It's a story about order, purpose, and a God who stands above the chaos of the world. That's way more interesting than the narrow interpretation we've been taught to believe. Now that we've established that Genesis 1 isn't some step by the way, let's take a closer look at one of the most intriguing phrases in the entire creation story, Tohu Bohu. You've probably heard it translated as formless and void, describing the state of the earth before God steps in and organizes things. But what does that even mean? And is it really as simple as the earth was empty and needed filling? First, we need to talk about what Tohu Bohu would have meant to the ancient Hebrews who wrote this text. The ancient Hebrews who wrote this text. This is one of those Hebrew phrases that doesn't translate cleanly into English. It's not like the writers were saying the earth was just a blank canvas, ready for God to get to work. No, it's deeper than that. In Hebrew, Tohu carries the sense of chaos or disorder. It's not just empty but wild. It's like a wasteland or wilderness, but with a chaotic edge. It's completely uninhabitable and disordered. Bohu is another tricky one. It only appears a couple of times in the Bible and always right next to Tohu. It seems like they're a set. Most scholars agree that it emphasizes the emptiness and futility of the scene. So we're talking about a world that's not just shapeless but chaotic, wild, and essentially pointless until God steps in. Here's where it gets interesting. This description isn't unique to the Bible. As it turns out, the idea of a chaotic, unordered state at the beginning of time also appears in other ancient texts, particularly in the creation myths of surrounding cultures. The Babylonians, for instance, believed that before creation, there was only this primeval chaos, symbolized by the goddess Tiamat, the embodiment of the untamed sea. Does this sound familiar? As we discussed before, Genesis 1 seems to be based on this idea of chaos, but with a few key differences. The Bible puts a new spin on it. There's no epic cosmic battle or gods battling it out to create the universe. In Genesis, chaos is there, but God just calmly speaks into it. It's like the writers of Genesis were saying, we've seen those Babylonian stories, but our God doesn't need to fight to create. He just commands, and the chaos falls in line. And here's another thing. When we read, formless and void, we usually think it means creation from nothing, which is what theologians call ex nihilo. But here's where the real controversy comes in. Genesis 1 verse 2 doesn't actually say that God created the world from nothing. It says that there was already something, a chaotic, formless mess, and God brought order to it. So, it's more like God took this wild, disordered state and started organizing it. This is a huge it means creation from nothing, which is what theologians call ex nihilo. But here's where the real controversy comes in. Genesis 1 verse 2 doesn't actually say that God created the world out of nothing. What it says is that there was already something, a chaotic, formless mess that God brought order to. So, rather than saying that God made everything from scratch, it's more like God took this wild, disordered state and started organizing it. This is a huge shift in how people usually read the text, especially if you've grown up thinking of God snapping his fingers and creating matter out of thin air. This is a big shift in how people usually read the text, especially if you've grown up thinking of God snapping his fingers and creating matter out of thin air. Tohu Wabo also challenges another big assumption, that the creation story is linear. A lot of people imagine Genesis 1 as a simple timeline, day 1, day 2, day 3, and so on. But if you look closely at how the ancient Hebrews might have understood it, it's more like God is setting up domains. Then he fills them. Days 1 through 3 are about creating realms, light and dark, sky and water, land and sea. Then in days 4 through 6, he populates those realms, sun and moon, birds and fish, animals and humans. So what's happening in Tohu Wabo is more about function than about building something from scratch. It's not that the earth was just sitting there like a blank sheet of paper waiting to be filled. It's that the earth was chaotic, it was functional, and God came in to give it purpose. There's also a lot of debate among scholars about what this chaotic state really represented. Some think it's symbolic of a world that's not yet suitable for human life, while others suggest it's a metaphor for moral and spiritual disorder. And let's not forget the ancient Israelites themselves. They had spent centuries surrounded by desert wastelands and chaotic seas. They knew chaos intimately. To them, Tohu Wabo wasn't just about physical emptiness. It was a spiritual and existential concept. It represented a world that was inhospitable to life, not just because it lacked form, but because it lacked purpose, direction, and order. The real creation wasn't just the forming of physical things. It was God stepping in to bring meaning to a meaningless state. And don't think for a second that this idea of chaos before creation ends in Genesis 1. Later on, in books like Isaiah, we see Tohu being used to describe desolation and judgment. It's not just a one-time thing. Time deal, the concept of Tohu Wabo, who became a powerful image throughout Hebrew scripture for describing a world that's lost its way. This is a world that's reverted to chaos because of disobedience or sin. Now, we need to dig deeper into another curious detail that often gets overlooked, the name of God used in Genesis 1, Elohim. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Things get really interesting here. The word Elohim is actually plural in Hebrew. That's right, plural. It's strange, isn't it? We're taught from a young age that the God of the Bible is one God. And yet, there we are with this plural word used to describe him. What's going on? First, let's clear one thing up. Elohim doesn't mean there are multiple gods involved in the creation story. The Hebrew Bible is very clear on that. There's only one God. But the fact that Elohim is plural raises some fascinating questions about how the ancient Israelites. It's interesting to consider how the Israelites viewed God and his role in creation. It's almost like a subtle nod to something bigger happening behind the scenes, something that's not entirely explained in Genesis 1, but is there nonetheless. The use of Elohim ties directly into the ancient Near Eastern context. In the cultures surrounding Israel, places like Canaan, Egypt, and Babylon, the sky was crowded with gods. You had gods for the sun, the moon, the rivers, the sea, fertility, war, you name it. Every realm of existence had its own deity or deities managing it. Genesis 1 seems to challenge the idea that many gods were involved in creating the universe. Instead of multiple gods competing or cooperating, the text presents a single God, Elohim, who is in control. There is no divine council or conflict among gods. There is just one supreme being who is in charge of bringing order to the universe. This shift in theology is significant. The ancient Israelites were making a bold statement. The Bible says that our God is powerful enough to do it all by himself. But even though Elohim is used in the plural form, the verbs and actions in the Hebrew text remain singular. It seems like the Bible is saying that while Elohim is plural, this isn't about multiple gods. It's about one God who is so powerful that his name reflects the fullness of his power. It's about one God who is so powerful. His name reflects the fullness of his power, even if it's plural. Some scholars have suggested that this plural form reflects something like a majestic plural, a way of emphasizing God's ultimate authority and grandeur. It's not just any God. But there's more. The concept of Elohim might also reflect the divine council imagery that pops up later in the Bible. Have you heard of Psalm 82? In that passage, Elohim is portrayed as the head of a divine council where God presides. Over lesser divine beings or angels, it's a bit like a heavenly boardroom meeting, but with God as the CEO. Some scholars argue that the plural form of Elohim in Genesis 1 might hint at this ancient idea that there's one supreme God, but he's not alone in the spiritual realm. This doesn't mean there were multiple creators in Genesis 1, but it does open up an interesting perspective. Maybe the ancient Israelites had a more nuanced view of the spiritual world than we often give them credit for. They weren't strict monotheists right from the start. Their understanding of God evolved over time. In the earliest days of Israelite religion, they may have believed in other spiritual beings, lesser gods, or angels, who served under the supreme Elohim. And this gets even more intriguing when you start looking at the Canaanite religion had a high god named El who ruled over a divine council made up of lesser gods, including the storm god Baal. Some scholars think the Israelites adopted some of this language but redefined it to fit their belief in one true God. So when they use Elohim in Genesis 1, they might be tapping into this broader cultural framework. Instead of many gods working together, you have one God whose power is unmatched, even if his name still echoes that ancient plural form. The thing is, when we read Elohim in Genesis 1, we're not just seeing a relic of Israel's polytheistic neighbors. We're seeing an evolution in theology. It's like the Bible is subtly hinting at the complexity of God's nature, something that would become more fully developed in later scriptures. While the Israelites believed in one God, they were also grappling with the idea that God's presence and power were bigger, more expansive, and more complex than they could fully understand. So Elohim, a plural name, points to the fullness, the majesty, and the all-this-one God, who stands above all creation, is so much more than just a material being. Genesis 1 isn't really about material creation at all. It's about assigning function and purpose. I know it sounds strange at first, but stick with me because it's a game changer. To really get this, you need to understand how ancient people thought about the world. In modern times, we're obsessed with what things are made of. We want to know how. In the ancient world, people were more concerned with the purpose of things than their physical origins. They weren't asking how God created atoms and molecules. They were asking what the sun, moon, animals, and humans were for. Their idea of creation wasn't about material origins. It was about functional origins. It's less about what something is and more about what something is for. John Walton's work, especially his book The Lost World of Genesis 1, explains this well. He says that in Genesis 1, God isn't just creating stuff. He's establishing functions. Take light, for example. When God says, "Let there be light," He's not creating photons out of nothing. He's assigning the function of light. He's setting it in its role to govern day and night. And when He creates the sun and moon on the fourth day, He's giving them the function of marking time. It's not just about their physical presence in the sky. It's about what they do. You can see this pattern throughout Genesis 1. God separates the waters and creates the sky, not just as physical spaces but as domains with specific roles. The land is separated from the sea, but it's not just dirt and water. The land's function is to produce vegetation, and the sea's function is to be filled with living creatures. The story is about ordering the cosmos in a way that everything has its proper place and role. This shift from thinking about material creation to functional creation turns the whole Genesis narrative on its head. We tend to think of creation as God making things, the earth, the sky, animals, humans, and so on. But the ancient audience would have been more focused on the idea that God is bringing order and purpose to everything. It's not about making something from nothing, it's about taking the chaotic, unordered state and giving it meaning. Take the creation of humanity, for instance. When God creates Adam and Eve, He doesn't just make physical beings, He assigns them a function to rule over the earth, to tend to it, and to multiply. The creation story makes it clear that humanity has a purpose. We're not just another part of the physical world. We've been given a specific role within God's ordered cosmos. This is where it all comes together with what we've already discussed. Remember how we talked about tohu and abohu representing disorder and chaos? Well, God's act of creation in Genesis 1 is about giving everything a place and a purpose. It's about taking that chaos and making it functional. Each day of creation isn't just about making more. It's about organizing the universe into a coherent, purposeful system where every element has a job to do. Even the structure of the creation narrative reflects this idea of functional order. In the first 3 days, God creates domains day and night, sky and water, land and vegetation. Then, in the next 3 days, He fills those domains with their functionaries, the sun and moon to govern day and night, birds and fish to fill the sky and sea, animals and humans to inhabit the land. It's a structured, ordered system. The process of assigning functions is not a chaotic burst of material creation. This brings us to a key point when we understand Genesis 1 as a story of functional creation. It stops being about how the world was made in a physical sense and starts being about why the world exists in the way it does. The ancient audience didn't care about whether the earth was 6,000 years old or billions of years old. What mattered to them was purpose. Why does the sun rise? What's the point of the stars? Why do humans exist? Genesis 1 answers those questions by showing a God who assigns purpose and order to a chaotic, meaningless world. This doesn't mean that the material world wasn't important. Of course it was. The focus of Genesis 1 is much more about establishing roles than about describing the mechanics of physical creation. It's not a science textbook. It's a cosmic declaration of purpose. God's creating isn't about things. It's about functions. The world isn't just a bunch of random stuff thrown together. It's an ordered system and everything within it has a role to play. We've covered some groundbreaking ideas about how Genesis 1 is really about bringing order and assigning functions. But what if I told you this story is also directly connected to a pivotal moment in Israel's history? We're talking about the Babylonian exile, a period of deep crisis for the Israelites that shaped much of how they understood their relationship with God and the world around them. And Genesis 1 wasn't just some random story written. If we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, we can see that the historical context of the Babylonian exile shaped the way the Israelites understood their relationship with God and the world around them. Let's go back to the 6th century BC. The Israelites had been conquered by the Babylonians, their temple destroyed, and many of them were taken into exile. They were in a foreign land surrounded by foreign gods, and their sense of identity was under threat. In the midst of this, they were exposed to Babylonian myths, especially their creation story. The Enuma Elish myth was everywhere in Babylon. It was probably even recited during religious festivals. The Enuma Elish tells the story of the god Marduk, who defeats the chaotic sea goddess Tiamat and splits her body in half to create the heavens and the earth. In this story, creation comes out of a violent battle between gods, with Marduk reigning supreme. Now, think about how that would have hit the Israelites, who believed in one. All the Israelites believed in a powerful God who didn't need to fight or struggle to create the universe. They were in exile and hearing this story about a pantheon of gods clashing in chaotic warfare to bring the world into being. It didn't line up with what they knew about their God, Yahweh. So, Genesis 1 started to take shape as a direct response to this Babylonian worldview. The writers of Genesis were saying, "You've got this story of gods fighting and chaos ruling, but our God doesn't operate like that. The world is born out of violence in the Babylonian myth. Marduk has to conquer chaos and creation is a result of war." But look at Genesis 1. There's no violence or struggle. God doesn't battle with the forces of chaos. He simply speaks, and order happens. Let there be light, and there it is. This isn't just a theological statement, it's a political one. Genesis 1 is saying that our God is supreme. He doesn't need to fight to establish his rule. It's a direct contradiction to the Babylonian myth, where power is asserted through conquest. The structure of Genesis 1 also contrasts with the Babylonian myth. The Babylonian myth is all about Marduk consolidating power among the gods and positioning himself as the king of the divine council. It's filled with drama, divine politics, and as we said, a lot of violence. But in Genesis 1, Elohim is in complete control from the start. He's not part of a divine council, he is the council. He's not negotiating or fighting for his place. It's pretty straightforward. The world just responds to his word. Light appears, the waters are divided, dry land forms, and life begins to thrive. All because God spoke. There's no need for divine warfare because there's no competition. So why is this such a big deal? Because at its core, Genesis 1 isn't just a story about how the world came to be. It's about who has the power. The Israelites were living in exile at the time. This was more than just some theological trivia. They were under Babylonian rule, a kingdom that saw Marduk as the ultimate deity. They were hearing stories about how the world was shaped by violence and struggle. Genesis 1 offered a radically different vision. It told the Israelites that, despite what the Babylonians believed, their God was still in control. Even in the heart of Babylon, God was still in control. Think about how empowering that would have been for the Israelites. They were in exile, their temple had been destroyed, their land had been taken, and it seemed like the gods of Babylon had won. But Genesis 1 is saying otherwise. It's saying that the God who created everything and who spoke the world into order is still on the throne. This wasn't just a comforting message, it was a defiant declaration in the face of an oppressive empire. It was a bold statement in the face of an oppressive empire. Genesis 1 was their way of saying, our God doesn't play by the rules of your myths. He's beyond your gods. He doesn't need violence to rule the world. He speaks, and the world listens. And it's not just the content of the creation story that's radical. The very structure of Genesis 1 is, the repeated phrase, "And God saw that it was good," reflects a moral universe. In contrast to the violence and chaos of Babylonian myths, Genesis presents creation as inherently good, designed with purpose and care. There's no cosmic accident here, no divine battle scars in the fabric of the universe. It's all intentional, all ordered, and all good. Now, fast. Let's fast forward to when these stories are being told to the exiled Israelites. Genesis 1 isn't just theology, it's resistance literature. It's pushing back against the Babylonian narrative. It's saying, "We know what you think happened. We've heard your stories. But we're telling a different story. In our story, a God, the true God, speaks order into chaos without." Genesis 1 is all about creating without struggle. It's about a peaceful, sovereign God who speaks and it's done. There's one more piece to this puzzle, and it's probably the most overlooked part of the creation narrative: the relationship between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 and 2 tell two different stories about creation. The difference is significant. Many people read these two chapters as one continuous story, like the Bible is presenting two parts of creation. However, when you examine the text closely, you realize that these are two separate accounts. Genesis 1 describes the creation of the cosmos in 6 days, with God speaking everything into existence. Then, in Genesis 2, the tone and style change. It's no longer about God creating the universe in a cosmic, structured way. Instead, it zooms in and gets really personal. Here, we see God forming Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathing life into him. There's no mention of days, no systematic separation of light from darkness, and no, "let there be this or that." In fact, the order of events is totally different. Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 tell two different creation stories. In Genesis 1, humans are created last on day 6 after the animals. In Genesis 2, Adam is created first before any plants or animals exist. Then, God creates the Garden of Eden and brings all the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. Afterward, God creates Eve from Adam's rib. So, if you read these two accounts back to back, you'll see two creation stories that seem to be in direct contradiction. The two stories aren't just a mistake. They serve different purposes. Genesis 1 is all about the big picture. It's about God creating order and function in the universe. It's cosmic and broad. It focuses on how everything fits together. Genesis 2 is about relationship. It's personal. It zooms in on the creation of humanity and the intimacy between God and his creation. In Genesis 2, God isn't just speaking things into existence. He's not just creating something out of nothing. He's actually getting his hands dirty, literally shaping Adam from the dust and breathing life into him. This shows us that the focus is moving from universal order to the deep connection between humans and their Creator. Let me be clear, though. These two stories aren't at odds with each other. They're meant to complement each other, offering two different perspectives on creation. One is about the macro, the other about the micro. Genesis 1 shows us a God who speaks the universe into being with ultimate authority. Genesis 2, on the other hand, gives us a God who kneels in the dirt, crafting humans with care and tenderness. Together, these stories paint a fuller picture of who God is, both transcendent and immanent, both cosmic ruler and personal creator. But the fact that these stories differ in detail has sparked some serious debates over the centuries. Scholars have proposed that it's thought that these two accounts come from different sources. Genesis 1 is attributed to the priestly source, or P-source, which focuses on order, structure and the rituals that define Israel's relationship with God. Genesis 2 is attributed to the Yahweh's source, or J-source, which emphasizes the personal and relational aspects of God's interaction with humanity. So, what we're seeing in these two chapters isn't a contradiction, but two distinct theological traditions woven together to give us a richer understanding of God and creation. It's not a contradiction. It's two distinct theological traditions that are woven together to give us a richer understanding of God and creation. What's also interesting is how Genesis 2 shifts the narrative toward human responsibility. In Genesis 1, humanity's role is to be fruitful and multiply and to have dominion over the earth. But in Genesis 2, Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. This is a more intimate hands-on approach. On responsibility, it's important to note that humanity isn't just ruling over creation from a distance. We're deeply embedded in it. We're part of the earth, formed from its dust, and we're called to steward it. This brings us to a key takeaway. These two creation stories together tell us that the world isn't just a cosmic order we inhabit. It's a relationship we are meant to nurture. We're not just here to take from creation, but to care for it, to tend to it, to partner with God in keeping it alive and flourishing. That's a powerful message, especially for a world that often treats creation as something to be exploited rather than cherished. The creation story in the Bible is much more complex and meaningful than what we might have been taught. It's not just about how the world was made, it's about why it was made and who we are within it. It's about a God who orders the cosmos, brings purpose to chaos, and forms humanity with his own hands, calling us into relationship with him and with the world he's made. Thank you. Thanks for sticking with us on this journey. If you gained new insights or a different perspective on the creation story from this video, please like it, leave a comment, and subscribe to stay tuned for more deep dives like this one. And as always, God bless you all. See you in the next video.